All right, welcome everybody out. Thank you for stopping by after lunch like this. I know it's hard for some people to stick around. I appreciate it though very much. Thank you. And if you've seen me before, thank you for coming back, thinking I'm decent enough to hear it a second time around. But for this is going to be a new presentation for me. You're the guinea pigs, first people to get to see it, so please bear with me. Hopefully it all goes well. We'll find out as we're going along. I'm calling this I submitted the title of a Hillbilly's First C2, but internally in my head I always called it Baby's First C2, so I put both of them on the slide. And in the code I actually refer to it as Baby C2, so deal with it. Sorry about that. Okay, first of all, let me just introduce myself. Who am I? Those of you who've met me before, you already know all this, but my name is Adam Compton. I currently work for Trusted Sec up out of Cleveland up there. Wonderful team. But outside of that, I've been in InfoSec one form or another for 25, 26-ish years, somewhere in there now. I've worked for private industry, federal government. I've done presentations across the world, all that kind of fun stuff. I've done programming. I've done research development. Yeah, I've touched pretty much every aspect of InfoSec at this point, one way or another. Much of it is not my forte, so I keep coming back to pen testing, but no worries about that. I say hillbilly, born in eastern Kentucky, back in Pike County, Kentucky, so I qualify, I promise. I actually have Hatfield and McCoy both on my family tree, so don't worry about that. I am an old school Unix Linux user actually that was my first OS once I got out of Windows 3.11, jumped over to a Unix OS. Have no idea what a Unix OS it was at this time. The first one I remember was Slackware Linux, that I actually remember a name for. I think there was like an AT&T Linux or a Unix in there somewhere, I don't remember. But still, been doing this for a long time. And with all of this, new technologies come around, new things show up, and I find interest in it. I tend to be a little late to the game sometimes because I get stuck in my ways, working just pen testing, doing all that, and I end up using tools without understanding the full comprehension of them. And that's where this talk sort of came about, which brings us to why this talk. C2s. If you're doing pen testing, red teaming, InfoSec in general, you may have come across C2s, most likely you have. There's lots of them out there. It can be as simple as just, you can script something up easily enough in Python or in Bash, or not necessarily Bash, but like with Netcat, stuff like that. There's different ways you can do it. You can almost set one up with just SSH, very rudimentary, but you've used them in one way or another. Fundamentally, they're just like client-server applications at the very abstract base level. But they can be fun, they can give you lots of functionality and all that. I wanted a new project. I like programming, I am a pen tester, but all my degrees are in programming, so I like going back doing some coding every once in a while. The fact that I use C2s without understanding the fundamentals of them sometimes was bothering me, so I'm like, hey, I want to learn about them. I want to build one up from the ground up, or at least build up the comprehension and the steps and the understanding of them. So that goes into I wanted to understand the aspects of it, and as working on it, I'm like, this sounds like this might actually work out as a presentation topic. We'll find out. We'll see how well it turns out here this evening. So first and foremost, let's get out of the way some of the basics of what is a C2. As I said before, it is really just a client-server application that allows you to interface between a server and one or more remote systems. In the case of pen testing, red teaming, all that, usually a compromised system that allows you to have remote control or remote access to that box to perform commands and issue other service requests via it. Oh, excuse me. What is the purpose of a C2? Primarily so you have the ability to manage one or more other systems out there without having to jump onto them every single time. It helps maintain the connectivity, provides the functionality. And if you want to boil down what is a C2 to its bare components, as I said before, you have a client and a server, or in this case, a client and an agent, client and an implant. agent, implant, client, all used interchangeably by a lot of different people depending on what C2 you're talking about. In this talk, I'm going to just be using agent fundamentally for the part that runs on the compromised system or the client system. And finally, there's usually a front end some way in there. That front end might be a GUI application that allows you to visualize the connections. Think like Cobalt Strike there. Nice visual interface. You can see the connections. You can issue commands, drop down menus, all that fun stuff. It's very GUI-based application. You might also have text-based. A lot of the smaller developed ones, whether it's, think Metasploit. Metasploit is a C2. It very much is text-based unless you pay for their paid version, and then you can get a GUI version for that. But fundamentally, it is a text-based one, so you can interface that way. I've seen some that interface with a phone, so you might have a phone app that allows you to interface a little bit. There's all kind of different things, a web app maybe. But all of them, all these user interfaces, all they are really doing is providing you, the user, ability to connect with the server and then use its functionality on or against the various agents that are out there. It's just that interface for the human. Many times you will find that the user interface and the server are not separable, but they are logically separate, but they're sometimes packaged together. Sometimes it's going to be a separate application. That's fine. You might have the server running, then you have the GUI application that connects to it. But either way, you do have those three primary components: some form of agent, a server, and then some form of a user interface. I've mentioned a few already, but what are some of the more popular C2s that I've encountered? This is a little bit biased list. It's the list that I've personally have used one or all of these of, and there's lots of them out there. You have your main ones up there like Metasploit that most of us are probably more familiar with, Cobalt Strike, and then beyond that you have the smaller or more boutique versions, I guess, out there, if you want to call it that. Sliver, Merlin, I don't think Russell is in the audience today, but shout out to him. Mythic, and then shout out to one of my coworkers for Bad Rats out there. All of these are functional. They have their own bells and whistles, their own take on how to implement a C2. There's a website out there on how to, the c2matrix.com. It's relatively up to date. There's other websites out there that can give you a more complete list or an alternate list of various C2s, but I just wanted to throw this up there for people to take a look at. As we're going through this, I've already talked about this a little bit, but let's cover the terms one last time to make sure we're all on the same page. The server is just a central controller. It sits there, it fires up. Most times it's referred to as a listener. A listener is just typically referred to more precisely as a protocol listener. You might have a listener for straight socket communication, or you might have a protocol listener for like HTTP traffic. Depending on what the protocol is that you're wanting to communicate over, you have to have a listener that's listening for those internal incoming connections and then providing you the ability to set up a session and communicate out over that. The server is the part that facilitates all that. You have agents. Agents can be as simple or as complex as you want, but they are the part that run on that remote system, on that compromised system. They might be just as trivial as a simple socket client that just allows you to have like a netcat almost, to have a shell on that box. It might be very complex where it's a several megabyte in size binary that is run over there that gives all kinds of bells and whistles, throws the kitchen sink in there. It varies in size, but it is still that part that runs on the remote system. And of course the front end, as we've discussed already, is just the part that allows you to interface with the server and through it to the agent. Most of what I'm going over right here is just so that we cover the basics, so we're all on the same bare ground. I'll be getting through this relatively soon here. Oh, excuse me. I ate too much for lunch and I got a little drowsy, I guess. But yeah, so what kind of agents are there? Not only are there small agents, large agents, agents written in C, written in Python, written in C#, what have you, but the way that they want to connect back. The scenarios that you generally encounter are where you have one compromised system and the server is just 1-to-1 ratio. It's as simple as, think SSH. You're connecting in, done. Or you might have multiple agents connecting back in. This is typical with think a web server. Lots of clients connecting into the web server to either do a push or a post or a get to the web server. That's a many-to-one relationship. That's another scenario, probably the most common one. And then finally, honestly, I had to just pull this one out of the thin air, just calling them chained agents. I don't know a proper term for it. If somebody does, please let me know. It's a scenario where you're having to chain multiple agents together, typically used in scenarios where you're doing pivoting, things of that nature. You might have a compromised system in network 1, which has access to network 2, and it then connects back to agent. You have an agent there as well, and it connects back, and then it connects all the way back. So you're pivoting, you're using sort of a jump box mentality. So those are the kind of the scenarios. These can be one-offs, they can be a mixture of these, ever how you want to facilitate or view it. Outside of my words, just a little graphical version. You're sitting out there with yourself as the attacker. You have the internet in front of you. Through some mechanism, you get an implant agent on some remote system behind a firewall, internal to a company. Ideally, a company you have a contract to work with, because otherwise you might be getting nasty little knocks on your door, but still, it gets on there. It might be through social engineering. It might be whatever the scenario. Somehow you got an implant on there and it calls back out because it has the ability to call out. It calls out to you, and via that connection, you have established a bidirectional communication between you and that internal server. That is a one agent scenario that we were talking about before. From there, maybe your phishing activity is, if that's what you were doing, established a second connection. Great, now you have two internal, multiple to one of your server. And somehow in there, somebody copied over whatever, let's say it was a binary they had to download and run. They thought something was suspicious about it. They connected it over to another internal system on another network, and it connects back. Whatever the scenario. I'm just trying to make stuff up here at this point just to give an explanation for this. But it's the different visual representations for what I was describing a little bit earlier there. And this is probably the way that most people will see a C2 implemented or visualized. But there is one last scenario here, and this is the one with redirectors. I'm not going to be going into too much detail in this talk talking about redirectors, but that is a scenario where none of the agents directly know about the server itself. It knows about a redirector out there on the internet. It can be done through cloud fronting. It can be done through any number of things where those agents will connect back to that, and then that redirects all traffic back to some other system you've designated being your server at this point, so that if something gets compromised or what have you, that box goes down, you can fire up another one using that same DNS name or what have you, and lo and behold, it's still going. Or you can switch something out. You can have multiple redirectors so that if the first one is compromised, it will try a secondary one, things of that nature. It all depends on how complex you want those agents to be. And that is something that needs to be incorporated both on the server and on the agent side. But as I said, I'm not going to be talking about that for the remainder of this talk unless somebody brings it up, and I'd be happy to, but it's not planned at this point. Oh, all right. So, for those of you who have used C2s or implement C2s or have designed C2s, what are your communication protocols of choice? Some of the more common ones I've seen are things going over HTTPS, things going over DNS, not so much anymore, but at one point in time there was a big push I saw in C2s and malware and things of that nature of trying to communicate out over DNS. Why? DNS tends to be not blocked by any organization for the most part. It can go out. How does DNS work? Well, Well, DNS itself works in its own way, but as far as a communication protocol, it would typically do something like it would make a request out for a particular DNS record for a domain that you control or what have you. And if that record is obviously not going to be a valid record, but it's going to be a trigger to some internal event on the server, meaning it needs its new tasking, or it's giving an output or something like that. If it's asking for a new task or new action to run, the response that would come back would be the command that needs to be run or something of that nature. So it's really slow communication back and forth, but it does work. I've seen some written in SSH. I've seen some examples that people have said learning how to write C2 and SSH. I don't know if anybody's actually implemented one using SSH as the protocol for communication, but if they have, great. But I throw it in there because I see a lot of articles about people trying SSH for it, but I don't know if any of the primary ones out there actually make use of that. And going back to like Metasploit and some of the older ones, straight TCP sockets, whether that's a reverse bind or an encrypted reverse bind, what have you, it is still just doing a straight TCP socket connection. And then whatever you send over that, it's up to you whether or not you encrypt it or what have you. Then honestly, there's been a growing number as well, I've noticed, of people using third-party software chat programs out there, whether it's Discord, it's Slack, it's whatever, as a tunnel, as a communication. They send commands up, and they'll either have a bot sitting out there, or they'll have a dedicated channel that they're listening for, and they'll interact back and forth using that as the mechanism to send and receive data to their agents. It's all handy. It's prevalent out there. A lot of organizations already allow outbound to chat, or to Slack and Discord, things of that nature. So it's already going to be going through their filters as it is. So good on that. Is there any others out there that people have made use of themselves? Just curious. No? IRC. Did you say IRC? I would almost throw that one under Discord and Slack, but yeah, I agree with you on that one. I don't know too many people offhand that use IRC a lot, but yeah, I can say I would throw like a Usenet and stuff like that in there as well, if you want to go back a little further. But yeah, anything like that would be good. But yeah, there's going to be other things out there. I've seen people use SMB shares or SMB pipes to do communication too, depending on connectivity of how separated the server and the agents are from each other. If you're internal and doing that, maybe. If you're if you're across a firewall or something like that, you could still do a UNC path, something like that, possibly, if you're uploading and downloading. It all depends on what you're going after there. So if we're wanting to actually build a C2, what are some of the things that we need to really decide on before we get started? This is going to be branching into the realm, unfortunately, for a lot of people, of barely putting your toe into software design. What goes into software engineering, software design? You have to think about the base of the problem, get that written down, get that decided, and then build off of that while keeping the end in mind. But yeah, I've seen a lot of times people are like, oh, I want this bell, I want this whistle. Well, let's get the framework in place so we can add those bells and whistles later on. First thing I would say is probably that middle one there, the server language. What language are you comfortable in that you want to write this server in? It doesn't really matter to me. It doesn't really matter to the server, as long as you're familiar with the language enough to write socket or web server implementation within that. Personally, I'm going to go with Python. It's the one I'm most comfortable in at the moment. It's the one that I actually wrote what I wrote in Python, but I've seen versions written in Go, written in PHP and Ruby and C# and any number of languages. Ultimately, it goes down to what you feel most comfortable in writing it in. Just because someone like me says, I wrote it in Python, does not mean you need to write yours in Python. I'm showing an example in Python, but that is just it. You need to decide on what kind of, well, at some point you need to worry about your user interface. Do you want text, graphical, web? Depending on your inclination and what language you're using, one is going to be easier than the other. I just went with text. It's easiest for me because it's just a command line interface, or it's There's any number of Python libraries out there that will give you menus and what have you. So I went with that route. Finally, what communication protocols do you want to use? Do you want to use SSH? There was a couple, like I said, a couple how-tos out there on doing that. So I decided why not try that one. HTTP or HTTPS, why not? I see a lot of ones out there making use of that as well because HTTPS is already allowed outbound on a lot of servers or a lot of networks. Not all, but a lot. And then straight TCP sockets. Just because, well, I like to go old school sometimes with keep my memory open of Metasploit and whatnot and just straight reverse shells. But these are the kind of things, the base level that you need to try to decide on as you're going through this. To help you decide on the communication protocols a little bit, there's just a few things you might want to keep in mind. And I do have some little sample code in there. You don't have to worry about that too much right now. But if you wanted to go with straight TCP sockets, any programming book you find that talks about socket communication is going to give you sample code for a server and client using TCP sockets. If you're old school Unix with C programming, the old Stevens books, the network programming book, has like a whole chapter just on that. You can easily find code to handle this. And it's easy, it's direct control, but it does require opening additional ports on the server or on the client, and it's probably going to raise some bells and raise some flags at some point in there, easily detected. HTTPS, commonly used, blends in with web traffic, generally allowed through firewalls. It can be used with web proxies because the web proxy itself doesn't really modify the data. There's some issues in there with sending files and whatnot, but it should still be able to work fine depending on how it breaks up and intercepts and inspects it. If it's not a manipulation proxy, it should be fine. Disadvantages: can be noisy, might again trigger anomaly systems, especially if they see a lot of traffic from multiple systems going out to a new server that wasn't identified in the past. Just anomalous detection in there, but it's likely going to be sufficient to get you through whichever scenario you're working with at the moment. SSH, again, similar to before, it's encrypted. It's hard to intercept, things of that nature, but it too is going to trigger a bunch of alerts potentially, and you do have to configure a SSH server somewhere depending on the way you want to implement this. In order to get, because from my own experience with the SSH, I'll talk about this again in a minute, but in order to get this working, you need a straight SSH command is not going to work the way you expect unless the agent itself contains the SSH server. That's not the path I went with. I went with the server containing the SSH server. Then I wrote a modified SSH client for the agent that basically establishes a reverse connection. So it connects and then it's just listening for reverse communication. It works, but a standard SSH client is not going to, or SSH command is not going to work for you in this scenario the way I have it implemented and the way I've seen most people try to implement it. And finally, DNS, as I was saying before. So let's go ahead and get started on some of this coding. I'll go through a few slides of some of the things I tried, some of the way I have it working, and then I'll show you some of the code I actually have, the way it works. I will forewarn you, it is not exciting watching the code run because it's really, I start the server, I run the client, and it works. I can show you the code. I would show you a more elaborate version of it that used my Windows server, my Windows VM and all that, but it crashed and got corrupted this morning, late last night this morning, and it's not working. So I'll have to ask your forgiveness on that, but I will update it and put out a modified recorded video of that to my website later on. But as of right now, let's go ahead. So I was just going to start with just a straight TCP socket connection. First off, as I said, this is in Python. What I'm going to be looking for there is I need to set up just a standard listener, or socket, if you will. It's just going to sit there and listen. It's listening, binding to a particular host and port. In this case, host, I'm just doing 127.0.0.1 or 0.0.0.0 for it to listen on all ports or all IPs. Pick something that is high level, or if you're running with administrative privileges, you can go on the low order ports there. I tend to pick something like 8443 or something like that. That is sort of common, but not likely to be in use somewhere on your system at least. And then you just sit there and listen. That section between lines 21 and 24 is the part I would typically put out into a separate thread so it can handle multiple connections. In this scenario, I'm just doing, a scenario where it's one client to the server, and that line 21 to 24 there is commonly where I would, as I said, there would be a loop around there. It would constantly be listening for a new connection. Once it received a new connection, a new bind, actually line 22 there, it would listen for a new connection. Once it grabbed one, it would accept it, and it would take some identifier of that and store it as an array, into an array, saying that this is a new session. And then there'd be a way for me to specify which one I want to interact with, and I would jump into that. But right now I'm going straight through, assuming just one client coming in. And then if I go back there, the last thing that did on line 24 is it just calls the command loop on that particular socket. What the command loop does is just loops over, saying, okay, prompt, give me a command. It takes in the command and it sends it off to the agent. Agent does something with it, and then it sends data back. I capture the return. If it actually looks like there was something there, I reconstruct it and print it out. This is me wanting to run a command on the remote system and just get the output back. This is the dirt simplest version of a remote access that you can pretty much code in here in Python. You can do simpler ones in some other languages that have tailored things for this, but this is the fundamental of what you would be looking for there. What would work with this as an agent? You could use Netcat as an agent for this one because there's so little going on in there. In this one, you could do something like just Netcat, connect back with bin bash or CMD or PowerShell, things of that nature, and it would work fine. There's actually a great website. If you want to go out to https://www.revshells.com, in there, that's a great website that you can go to that will let you have, you can specify what your listener is, what kind of system you're on, what kind of shell you want, and it will give you the command that you can actually use to establish that connection back. For things such as this would be fine. Let's say that we wanted, instead of using Netcat, we wanted to use agents. It's a little more complicated in there. First thing it does there on line 5 is it actually tries to connect out, or creates a socket, goes to line 7, tries to connect to the server. Assuming it can, then it just sits there and goes into a loop from line 8 to 13, and all it does there is says, hey, is there something you want to send me? Yes, you sent me something. I'm assuming that's a command. I'm going to run it, take the output, and send it back to you. That is boiling Netcat down to its fundamental essence here for this scenario. Really straightforward, really simple. Some other things you might want to look at. As I said, you could implement this with Netcat, but you can also just do TCP dump and capture everything that Netcat is saying too, or this agent is saying. So we need to implement some kind of encryption, most likely. Encryption is important. It makes it harder to intercept, makes it harder to do whatever with it, to modify it. Two of the most common types of encryption I see being used on C2s, it looks like, is AES and RSA. AES is typically used, in my experience, for all communication back and forth, with the exception of possibly the initial handshake, the initial check-in, registration, things of that nature, which is a lot of times being done with RSA. And that does, it connects and tries to establish a shared key between the two, a unique shared key for that individual session, and then all further communication is using that unique key for AES encryption back and forth. So that if one agent actually gets compromised somehow and they intercept that key or whatever, that is not going to allow them to decrypt any other agent communication. It separates out all of that, and that's fine. If I wanted to implement that in the super simple version that we wrote here, I would write out two little methods here, encrypt and decrypt. You receive in the passed in data, you do something with that, and you return the encrypted data, or vice versa. You can incorporate in there the AES encryption, you can incorporate in there XOR, you can put in there whatever you want. As long as it's abstracted this way, your agent and your server don't care what it is. It just cares that there are those two functions that work. For my particular, I'll come to that here in a second. I was gonna say, for my particular scenario, I use base 64 encoding. It works. It's not good, but for demo purposes, it worked. And going back, how would that change your server? For the server, whenever I type in a command, now I just encrypt that command and I send that encrypted portion. Doesn't really change the code very much at all, just adds one extra line in there. And then when I go to receive data, I assume it's encrypted, I decrypt it, and then I parse the decrypted portion. It really just changes 2 lines in that code to facilitate that. Same thing for the agent, just in reverse order, not a big deal there. And then as I said, there's some simple encryption. Just use base 64. I will come back to this, assuming I have any bit of time at the end, I can come back and show you the code that I'm using. But as of right now, I've got code, I've uploaded it to GitHub. I'll share that here in a moment, or I'll send it down a tweet in a second or what have you. It's called babyc2_dev out on GitHub under my name, Titanus. It allows for multiple connections back and forth. It allows for multiple protocols. Currently it's HTTPS, TCP encrypted, straight TCP. I think I have SSH in there, and there might be another one on the way there. And it allows you to issue commands, upload, download, things like that for the most part. Not sure which version has been uploaded, but I will upload the latest version here in a bit. It doesn't do some of these other things, which I would consider more advanced topics for C2s, because what I have talked about will give you a functional interface to remote systems. If you boiled a C2 down to the bare basics, that's what you would have. Now, by no means is that going to be a C2 you'd want to use on any environment, but it gives you the concepts behind that. Things I would like to see added in there as bare basics, probably halfway down there, evade AV, evade endpoint protection. That's going to be an arms race with the vendors on that one, but that's going to be critical. As it is, it's going to be caught signature-based right off the bat. You want to evade that, you want to bypass that, so your agents will run. Better encryption. Base 64 is not good. It's kind of garbage, honestly, but it does illustrate the point. You'd want to replace it with RSA to establish, and then maybe an AES for communication traffic. That's fine. Sleep, jitter, and ping, depending on the way you want to view those. Those are going to be more of, right now, communication is straight open. I send a command, I get results back. Not a problem. But if you're watching traffic, that's going to be happening all the time. Okay, let's say we want to be a little more stealthy about it. I want to set up a whole list of commands that run. Okay, I type those up, send them in, and it's going to run them right away. Well, if I add in a sleep mechanism in there, the agent's only going to say every X amount of minutes, like every 5 minutes, every hour, in some cases I saw like days in between. It says, give me the next command. It runs the command, sends back the data. What a jitter does in there is that it randomizes that a little bit. It's going to be like every hour, plus or minus 20 minutes. It's going to shift in there a little bit to make it not as predictable, make it help evade a little bit. So the other things you want to add in there that are probably more common on some of the bigger C2s, BOF and COF loading. That's where I can push it's effectively you're pushing up binaries to the server, very abstractly, pushing up binaries to get them to run on a remote system while injecting them in such a way that it helps evade a little bit. It helps. That's a horrible explanation. Sorry about that. Strike that. BOF and COF loading. My brain completely fried on a better explanation for that. I'll come back to it. But loading in PowerShell scripts from your local system to run them on the remote system, that's fine. loading and compiling and executing C# assemblies from your own system onto the remote system. Basically ways to get this extra functionality up there. What I quickly talked about earlier was basically just setting up the base framework. From there you can expand it out into all these other things that are somewhat common on a lot of the other C2s out there. One that a lot of people I've talked to definitely say is required, more or less required, SOX proxies. It's not as common as I'd like it to see on C2s out there, but it is one where if it's there, it definitely gets used and it makes it very handy. There's different ways you can implement the SOX proxy, but either way, ever how it's implemented, once it's established, you can use things like proxy chains or things like that to run run commands from your system on the remote systems as if it was being run from there. So you can run like nmap, or you can run any number of other commands that way. I've been told that's about it. So sorry I had to rush through that. I will adjust for the next time I present. So if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, I do have other code I can show you, or I can sit down with you, talk to you more about it, or I will, if you follow me on Twitter or anything, I will post out the link to the repo for what I have written up. It's broken out into individual sections on how I wrote it for each individual section. You can follow along with that. Sorry about that. Thank you all for sitting in here with me. I know this one probably wasn't as lively as some of my other talks, but thank you nonetheless for sitting in here. Thank you.
We have some questions?
Questions, comments, concerns? Thought I heard someone? Nope.
Let them percolate a little bit and absorb it.
Yep, I guess so. Yeah, I know. I never like going right before lunch or right after lunch generally, because everybody's ready to go to lunch and then everybody's all tired afterwards, so no worries about that.
Hey, Adam.
Yes.
Do you have any tips for AV bypass or evasion for the currently available C2s that are out there, deploying them to a client device or a remote host, things like that?
If I heard, sorry about that, I didn't pick all of that up, but if I can summarize what I think you said is there any mechanism out there currently that's being used for avoiding AV or going bypass? Built into various C2s, there are mechanisms for that in some of them. Beyond that, there are general techniques that is used to bypass AMSI, to do randomization, to recompilation using C# assembly recompilation on site. There's other techniques that can be used out there, but as I said, that is an arms race, because that's where your endpoint protection vendors are actively working to detect everything that comes out new in that field. So it's always a back and forth with there. General techniques, yeah, there's some out there, but for the most part, whatever new technique comes out probably is going to have a relatively short shelf life of a few months maybe before it starts getting detected in mass out there. So it's just a matter of, if you're targeting an older network, you're probably lucky. If you're targeting a relatively mature lockdown network, most techniques are going to be caught relatively quickly. So it's all a matter of how advanced or how many layers of encryption or layers of obfuscation, all that you want to throw in there. So no worries. No. That's my son. He'll just be making fun of me. Anyone else? If not, thank you very much. I'll be around here for the next hour or two, whatever. Run me down, talk to me, and you have my contact information there, and I will also be posting out on Twitter there, probably later tonight, or maybe here in a little bit, where the GitHub repo is for it if you want to go look at it. As I said before, this is not something you should actually be using. It's something to use as a learning resource because it is very fundamentally flawed in some ways, but it is also getting at the base of how this kind of product can be written and what you need to, stepping stones to work your way through it. So, is that it?
All right. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.